Hello people of the internet, this is Kaiju Noir here with my review for the highly anticipated Shin Godzilla, the first Japanese Godzilla movie since Godzilla Final Wars way back in 2004. And so while it's unknown when exactly this movie is going to be released in America by Funimation, the movie has been out since this past Friday, and I luckily got the chance to see it with my friend Jonathan this past weekend, and so I've kind of been trying to formulate my thoughts around this film for like the last 2 days. And so after talking about it with several of my friends, both in spoiler and non-spoiler conversations, I feel like I've now kind of wrapped my head around this very unique entry into the franchise. And I should state this like right out the gate that this movie, which is directed by both Hideaki Anno and Shinji Higuchi, Hideaki Anno being the creator of Evangelion, as well as the person behind other such projects like Gunbuster and the live-action Cutie Honey film. And with Shinji Higuchi, he was the special effects director behind the 90s Gamera trilogy, as well as the director of the 2 live-action Attack on Titan movies that I previously reviewed with Enshoma. And what they brought to the table was a very experimental film. It's, like I said, it's a unique entry into the franchise in that it introduces a lot of new ideas, a lot of unique concepts to the film, while also paying a lot of respect to past Godzilla films. Most notably, Godzilla 54 and Godzilla 84. Especially 84, because I feel like it takes certain elements of that film and kind of expanded it to where those elements would encompass the entire film. Now, to get this out of the way, this movie is not a sequel to Godzilla 54, nor does it have any real ties to any past Godzilla film. Although it pretty much tries to be a spiritual successor to 54, going so far as to pretty much directly lift sound effects from that movie, and even having the exact same opening as 54, with the exact same stomping sounds, the black backdrop, white text of the movie's title, and even that classic 54 roar, but I'll get into that later. So what happens in this movie is that there is a big explosion that appears in the ocean. The government doesn't know what's going on. They try to cover it up by saying, oh, whatever happens in the ocean, it's definitely not going to happen to Japan. But before they can pull a cover story out of their asses, Godzilla shows up and he starts wreaking havoc in Japan. And so the rest of the movie then revolves around the politicians and their attempts at trying to deal with all the bureaucratic and red tape political bullshit that they have to go through in order to make any sort of decision, all while millions of lives are hanging by a thread and are, of course, their responsibility. As for characters, we have Hiroki Hasegawa as Rando Yaguchi, who is kind of the closest we have to a main protagonist. We spend the most time with this character, and I feel like he was the character I had like the most attachment to. And we also have Satomi Ishihara, who we previously saw as Hanji in the Attack on Titan films, as Kayoko Ann Patterson, who is kind of a representative of the United States government. She's kind of there to be like the bridge the gap between the Japanese and American politicians. Outside of those 2 characters, them being the Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary and the American representative, there aren't any other characters that play as big of a role as they do. However, this movie is filled to the brim with a lot of politicians, and that is definitely one of the biggest changes that this movie does in comparison to past Godzilla films. This movie is pretty much a political drama revolved around a Godzilla attack. All of the characters are politicians who are struggling to make these big decisions while dealing with their incompetent government system. And I feel like this movie is trying to do what Godzilla 54 did, in that it was trying to act as a social commentary on the current state of the Japanese government, whereas in Godzilla 54, it was kind of a representation of the tension between the people of Japan and their anger and hostility and frustrations towards the American government military, and how they were taking advantage of Japan by testing nuclear weapons near their country. Here, this movie seems to be commenting on how kind of incompetent the Japanese government seems to be, in that it's very difficult to make any sort of big change or any sort of big decision, because not only is there so much opposition against making such big, huge, drastic decisions, but you've also got an incompetent prime minister who is very inexperienced in dealing with this type of situation, and he tended to panic and sort of back out of any situation. That, and also there's a large influence of the American government, and they almost seem to have a larger role in the Japanese military side of things than the Japanese government does themselves. And this movie also feels a lot like Godzilla 84, in that there are also other international governments that each have their own say on the matter, and how it affects all of the relationships between all these different countries on a global scale. So when looking at this movie from a narrative perspective, this movie heavily revolves around the political drama that surrounds a typical Godzilla situation. And that is one of the biggest departures from the traditional Godzilla narrative. Instead of having a scientist or journalist or military personnel or any other average civilian get involved in the movie and allowing the audience to see what they see from the ground view, instead this movie revolves around the political side of a Godzilla attack, in that these characters are pretty much the kind of characters that we would get glimpses of in past Godzilla films, with the exception of 84, where you would probably see them for maybe a minute or two, discussing what strategy they're going to use, before cutting to a military montage of the Japanese Self-Defense Force whipping out their latest giant robot or maser cannon, or whatever it is that they need to fight whatever giant monster is attacking Japan that week. But instead, those strategical meetings, those political conflicts are the main focus of this movie. And so I feel like that is what's going to make or break this movie for a lot of people. Essentially, if you're the type of person who really enjoyed the political conflict in Godzilla 84, where the Japanese Prime Minister was at odds with America and Russia over how to deal with Godzilla's return, then this movie would most likely appeal mostly towards you. If you're the kind of individual who wants to see more like on-the-ground action, or want to see like some character like try to go out and uncover the truth, or someone who has like a position that allows them to easily be there at the scene, or try to like actively fight Godzilla, there's none of that here really. And for me personally, if you've seen my review of The Return of Godzilla, aka Godzilla 1984, then you know that the political talks in that film are one of my favorite aspects of that movie. And that was the aspect that I think really helped that film feel like a reflection of the political climate of the 1980s. And so I would really appreciated them expanding on that element here in this film. I do think that we could have had maybe one or two individuals, at least maybe someone who's like a relative of one of the politicians, be one of those like on the ground characters, so that we can get a better glimpse at the destruction Godzilla causes. Because while there are a lot of destruction sequences, none of them felt really personal. I feel like this is something that maybe Godzilla 54 did a little better, where we at least saw some characters, we followed some characters, even if they were there for minutes at a time, before we got to see their eventual demise, be it the reporters that were on the radio tower that Godzilla attacked, or the mother holding her two children over like a burning building. We don't really see any of that there. I feel like this movie tries to recapture the sense of horror and dread that Godzilla 54 did, but it doesn't have that like personal connection to any of the victims in that movie, only because we spend so much of our time on, the only characters that we spend so much of our time on are the people that are safe in their buildings. There is a sequence later on in the film where those same politicians are the victims of a Godzilla attack, and so I feel like that carried probably the most amount of weight, and was probably one of the best highlights of the movie. And I feel like that's also when, luckily enough, Hideaki Anno and Shin Higuchi kind of brought most of the spectacle out on the stage. As for the rest of the film, it relies heavily on scenes of the politicians talking to one another in like 3 or 4 different rooms or different environments. And it was kind of amusing trying to see just how many times Hideaki Anno can shoot a scene of people talking to one another, as he's trying to come up with so many different cinematic techniques that would make this sort of normally mundane situation look more visually appealing. There is one point where we get a POV shot from a laptop screen that a lot of characters are looking at the same time. Other than that, the movie kind of has a bit of a formula where we see Godzilla attacking one portion of the city, then cutting back to the characters talking. Then we cut to Godzilla destroying more scenery. It almost feels like the first episode of Evangelion. You can tell there's a lot of influence from Evangelion, to the point where they even start to use one particular song, like an edited version of one particular theme from the TV show, and incorporate it into this movie's soundtrack. For those of you who haven't seen the first episode of Evangelion, there's the whole setup where a giant monster appears out of nowhere. This is its first time appearing in Tokyo. People have no idea what's going on, and the government is at odds with how to deal with the monster, all while the monster is laying waste to everything that is being thrown at it. It's pretty much the exact same setup. And because we get a lot of this movie's exposition from characters who have no idea what Godzilla is and where he comes from, we get no backstory from Godzilla himself. And I think that's supposed to be intentional, because Godzilla, the way he's portrayed in this movie is, he's supposed to be as emotionally distant from the audience, as emotionally distant as possible. We're not supposed to sympathize with this monster. We're not supposed to feel any sort of emotional connection to him. He is simply a walking engine of destruction. He's kind of like a more active version of Godzilla 84. Godzilla 84, he's just a cross between a migrating animal and a living storm, where he just marches on a singular path of destruction, giving no damns about what's around him, and only kind of he doesn't even bother to take notice of humans unless they begin to provoke him. And Godzilla and Shin Gojira is pretty much like that as well, although he is a lot more aggressive when the humans finally find a weapon that can perform some amount of damage towards Godzilla. As for the characters themselves, I do like how, as the movie progresses, we're able to see the amount of physical and mental strain that gets placed on these characters, and how much of a toll this amount of stress can place on people in this sort of environment. It's a type of thing that I don't think has ever really been explored in any other Godzilla movie, simply because most movies tend to focus on the on-the-ground characters, as opposed to people who are in the safety of their own political environment. For instance, Anno and Higuchi, he's kind of, like I said, he's kind of the closest to being the main character, and I like how, as the movie progresses, he takes on a more active role, as he eventually gets promoted to leading a research team, and how he's the kind of like the driving force behind this team, even when things seem to be very doom and gloom for them. As for Kayoko Ann Patterson, the actress who played this character, the role required her to kind of phonetically learn quite a number of English lines, and so she would often switch between speaking in Japanese and English in order to make her come off as someone who is American. And I'm sorry to say, but her English is absolutely terrible. I mean, there were many scenes where my friend and we were leaning towards the screen trying to understand just what the hell she was saying. Speaking of which, the English-speaking Caucasian actors in this film, hilariously, they are no better than the Heisei Caucasian Godzilla actors from 20 years ago. Although, luckily, the English acting never gets to "take that, you dinosaurs" level of bad. Despite her questionable English-speaking skills, I did like that she had a lot of energy, and her character had a bit of that spunky attitude. I'm wondering if she had that type of charisma because she was meant to act American. I'm not really sure. I don't know if, like, American characters in other Japanese media are meant to be more charismatic, and slightly more over the top than Japanese characters. But considering how much I enjoyed her portrayal of Hanji in the Attack on Titan movies, who was also really over the, even like more absurdly over the top, maybe this could be due to her like acting skills, or maybe like that was the reason why she was chosen for this type of role. However, even though her character feels a little bit out of place in certain moments, I did like that her on-screen presence kind of lightened the mood at certain points of the film, and I liked her chemistry with Rando whenever they kind of have like back and forth conversations, and I do appreciate that, even though I wasn't able to understand like 90%, no, who am I kidding, like 99% of the dialogue in this movie. This was the type of film that required characters that spoke very formally, used very advanced forms of Japanese that not even my friend, who has been living in Japan for about a year, not even he can translate. These characters use pretty much the most advanced forms of Japanese, and so it was impossible for us to understand the specifics of the dialogue. However, I feel like the movie was easy enough to understand, at least on a visual level, which brought me to an aspect of the movie that I liked, where you can tell that there were scenes where they kind of some of the characters drop their formalities, where these characters have been like pretty much like in the same room for so long, trying to come up with some desperate means of saving as many lives as possible. There are just moments where they kind of are so exhausted that they kind of just drop all their formalities and kind of be real with one another, start talking more casual, speaking to each other more casually, and kind of feeling like more like real people. However, I feel like I really need to watch this film again with subtitles in order to get a full grasp of the characters themselves and how they were written in this movie, especially since this movie is a very dialogue-driven film. While I was entertained throughout the film, I feel like knowing exactly what the characters were saying will definitely solidify my opinions of this film. Since I talked a lot about the characters, the plot structure, and how Godzilla is portrayed in this film, I feel like maybe the last thing to talk about is the technical aspects of the film. The CG itself, it's very competent for the most part. However, there are portions near, especially in the beginning of the movie, where the CG used for Godzilla is a bit of an eyesore to watch, only because it's like, this is the kind of CG where the character model is moving at like 60 frames per second, which looks unnatural compared to the traditionally like 24 frames per second frame rate that the movie is shot in. And so Godzilla himself kind of moves a bit like absurdly fast in comparison to like his environment. And the other thing is that like the CGI, it has this very like glossy look to it. And it's also very distracting to see him interacting with CG boats as he's coming ashore onto Japan. I guess it's just me being so used to seeing model boats that when I see CG boats getting tossed into the air like they had no weight, it was very distracting for me. However, I feel like the CG really improves by the middle of the film. And of course, as you can see in the trailers, the CG looks almost like lifelike in a sense. There are certain close-up shots where the CG looks a little more questionable. Outside of that, it does a really good job at making you feel like this Godzilla is a living, breathing, nightmarish abomination of a creature. And speaking of Godzilla himself, I think I've mentioned this before in other videos, especially on the Sons of Serizawa podcast, that I really grew to like this new version of the Godzilla design. It's something new, it's something different, yet it still feels recognizably like Godzilla. And a lot of people, they really don't like this really weird zombie aesthetic that was applied to him. And for me, I'm all for like reinventing old idea. I mean, like, I know I mentioned this to a friend of mine where if I wanted to see a traditional Godzilla, I pretty much have like 62 years of material to fall back on. So I'm all for like a new interpretation as long as it pays respect to what came before. I feel like this movie definitely does that, especially with that, like, 84-esque characterization of Godzilla, along with the tone, political context, and the destruction that 54 revolved around. As for the sound effects, there was a really interesting creative choice that was made here, where if you saw the trailers, you were probably wondering if Godzilla was going to have a traditional roar, and that the stock roar was simply used as a placeholder, or if Godzilla actually was going to have literally the classic roar just slapped onto him. And not only is that the case here, but the majority of the music, as well as the sound effects, especially when it comes to explosions, are all stock roars, stock music, stock sound effects taken from previous Godzilla films, especially the Showa era. I feel like maybe like 90% of the sound effects used were taken from the Showa era, either like maybe like the 60s or 54. And so it was kind of a bit jarring at first to see like a new movie but have 50s or 60s quality audio placed over it. At least with the Godzilla roar, like whenever they used those classic Godzilla roars, they would at least try to enhance it a bit with some amount of echo, and to make it feel like, you know, that roar is actually like being bounced off of its surroundings. But as for everything else, it's very strange, especially there's like a moment where you would hear like the Godzilla march being played while a train is like heading towards Godzilla in the similar fashion that occurred in the 54 film. I feel like this was like Hideaki Anno and Shinji Higuchi's way of like paying tribute to past films while doing something that no one has ever attempted to do. I mean, like, maybe you would have like a Transformers film or a cartoon or a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle or a cartoon, or they would maybe like play the theme song on their phone, on a TV screen or a laptop. But no, this movie actually just like takes the theme song and said, "You want it? Here you go, you got it," in its original, untouched form. Maybe it was sort of made simply as a gimmick, maybe it was made as a tribute, but it didn't bother me at first. Like I said, it bothered me at first, but I kind of quickly got used to it and kind of accepted it as being simply the style of this film. So I feel like that's all I can really say without spoiling what happens in the film. So I guess to wrap things up, I feel like this movie really tries to be something new and old at the same time. Maybe like the title itself, Shin Gojira, is made to be like, well, here's like a bunch of new ideas mixed with an old character, an old setup, and make it into something new, a new type of film that you've never experienced before. I have a feeling that this is going to be yet another polarizing film. There are going to be people who hate the new experimental vibe, or there are going to be people who will embrace this new take on Godzilla, or this new yet familiar take on Godzilla. For me personally, I really enjoyed a lot of what was given to us here. I didn't feel like this was a Godzilla movie where there was too much talking and not enough character interaction. But then again, that really falls on the fact that I unfortunately could not understand like the specifics of the character dialogue, and I feel like that will definitely kind of be like the defining feature of this film that will either like strengthen or change my opinion of the film. At the moment, I feel like this is without a doubt a good Godzilla film, but whether or not the characters are actually well written will make the difference between it being a good film and a great film. However, despite the questionable decisions with the style of the film, I will say that this movie is certainly unique and unforgettable, and it's definitely a Godzilla film that will stand out from the crowd, as opposed to being a film that would get lost in the shuffle of this franchise's 62-year journey. So I will give this movie a 3.5 out of 5. I know I've never given 0.5s before, but I really feel like this movie deserves one, at least in my case, because until I see a subtitled version, or maybe a dubbed version of this film in the near future, I cannot really give like a super concrete, definite opinion on the film. Although, like I said, I definitely think that it's a good movie, but I really want to know if the writing can make this movie go beyond good and great. So that's why I gave it a rating that's in the middle of 3, which I consider good, and 4 that I consider great. So, when this movie eventually comes to America, or if for any of you who are in Japan, I would definitely recommend watching Shin Gojira. It's a movie that provides a lot of chills, a lot of suspense, a lot of thought-provoking ideas, and I feel like that type of merit is definitely worth checking out this Godzilla movie. And for those of you who are already Godzilla fans and want to see that like classic Godzilla action that you were probably missing from the 2014 Godzilla film, I feel like this movie will bring about that type of like destruction and like apocalyptic horror that you were thirsty for. You may have been having doubts as to whether or not this movie can deliver that type of visual flair, judging by the trailers themselves, but let me assure you, there are moments in this movie that will make you go, holy shit! I feel like that is all I have to say on Shin Gojira. Thank you very much, everybody, for checking out this video, and hopefully by the time I come around to a properly translated version of the film, maybe I can give an updated thoughts and maybe possibly like a spoiler discussion in the near future. So with that said, I have been Kaiji Noir, and until next time, take care.